Welcome back. Hello everyone. Today in Intro to Visual Arts we're talking about the second part in chapter 19, moving into the 19th century. Today we're going to be talking about realism, impressionism, and post-impressionism. And one of the things that I want you to think about is how these movements are defined and who are the best known artists or practitioners in each of those movements. So you should be able to identify key artworks and key artists in each of those three movements. Before I do that though, I wanted to remind you there is extra credit opportunity. I know you all like extra credit. So that challenge is to represent yourself as any of the artworks that we've talked about this semester. So one that you find in the book that we've discussed, and you can recreate, like this person did, The Death of Marat by Jacques-Louis David. So have fun with that. It's a fun challenge. A lot of people are doing it on Instagram too. There's a lot of museums like the Getty and MoMA are challenging their viewers, their visitors, their audience that can't go to the museum right now. Instead, recreate these in quarantine as we're in self-isolation here. So fun challenge. See if you can do it. Doesn't necessarily have to be yourself. Could include an image of you. Could be your dog, your cat, your friend, parent, whatever, roommate. To take advantage of this extra credit. So there's that. That's fun. Use that as a challenge, but I think it shows, a way of kind of recreating the composition and understanding it from a different level. So have fun with that challenge. So today, talking about impressionism, post-impressionism, and realism, one of the things that I want you to think about is how sometimes these art movements aren't easily summed up or just represented by one kind of idea, that there isn't this sort of clean group of artists that say, okay, let's start making realism now, or let's start making impressionism. It isn't always kind of neatly wrapped up. There's a little bit of a back and forth. There's some kind of looking forward, there's some looking back, and sometimes things kind of slip from one movement to another. So an example of that is ending where we left off last time was Romanticism, and that influences realism. So an example, a late period Romantic painting is this image by Géricault, and it's called The Raft of the Medusa. In a sense, it's a history painting, and remember at that time in the Salon, in the Academy, in France, in England, what people valued the most was historical paintings, paintings that were produced on a large scale. This one is 16 by 24 feet, so all of those figures in it are life-size. Massive painting, really, really huge. So these paintings that were favored were ones that showed some kind of, an instance of Hannibal crossing the Alps, or a Greek tragedy, or a biblical scene, something historical and accurate. Well, Géricault's painting here is interesting because he painted it right after it actually happened. And it was a way of showing how power could corrupt. So in a sense, it's not Romanticism as in like nature overtaking humans, even though we see that in this image as well. Mostly what it was about was a critique of the government that was in charge at the time. So this is a true story. This was a ship that was carrying soldiers and settlers from France to Senegal and Africa on the African coast. And the ship was shipwrecked. And the captain and some of the crew took the raft. The policy back in the day was the captain should go down with the ship. And instead, they took the few lifeboats that there were, the life rafts, and they left everyone else out to die. And what these people did was they kind of cobbled together the 150 people that were left off of these lifeboats, quickly built this raft that they then, used to try to survive this shipwreck, this ship going down in the middle of the sea. And part of the issue that, outraged Géricault in the day, and also people that happened, was not just the instance that this captain kind of left his passengers out to hang, was also the fact that it was kind of corrupt because he was put in charge because he was related to Napoleon III, who was the monarch at the time, put in place, and a descendant of Napoleon. He got his job sort of by nepotism as opposed to something that was deserved, right? So that was this kind of like seen as you know, corruption, right, as the best example. Don't put the best person in charge, put the person in charge as related to, you know, someone in power. And the other thing too was the French government tried to sweep this under the rug and say, well, you know, they were protected, they were at least, they were given a raft, and they tried to save them, which actually wasn't true. And you can see in this image here, a lot of the people died. Out of 150, only about 12 survived that later were rescued. And you can see in the back a boat way back here in the distance, and they're kind of futilely reaching out and trying to be saved. So this painting is about corruption. It's about an actual event. Instead of it being like distant history, it's a historical painting, but it's a historical painting of a contemporary event. It's like contemporary historical painting is referencing an actual event that had just happened. And one of the things that's interesting is Jericho. So this is Romanticism, right? This is the kind of tail end of Romanticism, but it's kind of looking forward into realism. And the reason this influences realism is one of Jericho's students and model is right here. This is Delacroix. And he's in the painting, and Jericho posed dead figures from the morgue to get this. So there's this kind of level of truth and reality that's in it that's not quite like Romanticism, like we saw like Caspar David Friedrich. So it's kind of moving into this new realm. But we do see nature, the sublime, remember this like horrific force, nature overtaking man. We still see that, kind of like Turner's Slave Ship. But here it's kind of turning a corner. It's going into something else. So this is this transition into realism. What is realism? Well, it's influenced by the social reality of the day. And it also sought to represent everyday scenes. It was reality and not idealism, where if you think about Romanticism was much more about the ideal and about kind of good versus evil and the sublime, thoughts of the Enlightenment. And later artists in the realist movement, like Gustave Courbet, is probably the best known realist artist. And he was inspired by Karl Marx, his Communist Manifesto that said, the social reality of the day was that, one of the premises from the Communist Manifesto was that kind of the rich keep getting richer, and it's a result of the everyday worker, right? That wealth is built on the backs of the worker, which he called the proletariat, right? The bourgeoisie were the wealthy, the proletariat was the everyday worker. It's like the bourgeoisie were able to develop wealth as a result of the proletariat's efforts. And so this is something that people think about today as well, with, if you think about, communism is based on this, but also socialism is based on this idea. But without it being even just a political reality, it can also get people to be thinking about just everyday kind of morality, how you should treat the working class, how you should treat perhaps those who have less than you. And that was these new artists in the realist movement were seeking to show that sort of reality. Instead of celebrating the monarch, instead of celebrating the bourgeoisie, the powers that already had, they were celebrating the have-nots, right? So Delacroix, remember, he's a student of Jericho, and this is the second French Revolution. This is when the people kind of go up in arms again, and they're like, this time we're going to get it right. French Revolution, if you remember, didn't quite stick because afterwards you had Napoleon, and then basically, descendants of Louis XIV, and then again descendants of Napoleon become in power, and there was still corruption. So the second time around, and here you see realism as opposed to idealism. You've got Lady Liberty leading the people. Very, very famous painting. Coldplay, as an example, used this, right, as a cover of one of their albums. But you can see it's not a sense of nature and the sublime like in the background. It's almost like the background, even though this is the city in Paris, during the barricades and people kind of protesting against the government. Instead, you see the reality of this. It's kind of like being neutral or unbiased and just sort of reporting this. You've got, no winners, no losers. Everyone's a loser in this, in a sense. And that's kind of the reality of depicting things as you see them. So, as I mentioned, Gustave Courbet is one of the most well-known practitioners of realism. On the left, you can see this image of Caspar David Friedrich, Romanticism, the sublime, man contemplating his place in nature, but really it's kind of about the bourgeoisie. And in the right here, this image is not in the book. They show the burial at Ornans instead, this very famous painting by Gustave Courbet here. Which I think is a really nice painting, and it illustrates the idea of everyday social situations. These were just common. That painting was rejected from the salon of the day because the people thought it's just everyday people. Why would we put this in? And this is what this painting is as well. The Stone Breakers. That's what this painting is known as. Gustave Courbet. It's interesting because it no longer exists, and so this painting was destroyed likely by Allied bombers who thought they were tracking Nazis and bombed a military caravan, and in one of those trucks was likely this painting. So it was destroyed during World War II. So, at the time it was about 100 years old. This is a very interesting, we don't know if it's been destroyed or not. It's only thought to have been destroyed. It could be hiding somewhere in someone's camped out, and they got a collection illegally during World War II when Hitler was stealing all these great pieces. So what's interesting about this piece, if we look at Courbet's depiction here, and you can see in the figures, it's a dad and a son doing this back-breaking effort of chipping away larger rocks, moving them and turning them into gravel to make a road so that everybody can travel on it. It's sort of like the everyday heroes that we should be thankful for, but we don't think about them. And look at their clothes. They've got like these, pants that have been sewed and stitched numerous times. You've got, his back is wide open. You can see this is back-breaking work. You've got holes in the clothes. Who would paint this? This guy, yeah, he's like a distinguished gentleman. Of course, Caspar David Friedrich would paint him. Or a scene that's like very heroic or historic. Yeah, we'd paint that. That makes sense. But here, the subject isn't some dignitary or politician or wealthy person. It's us. It's the everyday person. So it's really interesting how the focus gets shifted from kind of what's up here on a pedestal to what's down below. And this was painted right after the Communist Manifesto was written, and which in 1848, the ideas of the Communist Manifesto were that it's the people that are digging in the dirt that are the true reflection of what's happening in the social conditions. And he was responding to all of these revolutions that were happening and saying, this is what we should focus on. This is what our kind of new reality should be. So it's the virtue of those who are really struggling to make it. And you can see over here, they're going to be ready, they're going to keep working even through lunch. They got their meal over here and their knapsack and their pot that they're going to cook over a flame. And they're just going to keep going. These look like Crocs, don't they? He's kind of wearing these wooden clogs that are they're not thinking about fashion. They're thinking about utility. So this is penultimate realism. This is realism, an attempt to represent real, ordinary people and their daily lives. So this is inspired by Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, and ideas of what makes society really work. And it's kind of been a neglected aspect of our thinking. This is a very interesting image, realism to the extreme. You can really see, and this is Rosa Bonheur, and her plowing in Nirvana was commissioned in response to the French Revolution of 1848. And it shows her belief in the virtue, like I mentioned, of working in the soil. That is like the soul of France, is not in this bourgeoisie. It's in the proletariat. It's in the everyday common person. What an amazing painting, though. Very detailed. I mean, when you look at this, you kind of squint. It looks like a photograph. And this might be a scene that we take for granted every day. We might see this, driving, see cows, see people plowing in the fields. But this would have been something that was kind of like a an era of the gone by, bygone era of just like the way things used to be, in a sense, like romanticizing the idyllic and a day's hard work, right? So you see these people plowing the field, working with the cattle and kind of the strength of the cattle. It's a really amazing ability to depict these animals too. You can tell she carefully studied them. In this painting and others, this ability to depict realism, the dirt, the animals, made her the most famous female artist of her day. So it's really interesting to see her place. But it's about social virtue, morality, and the ability to make an interesting aesthetic composition, but one that has content in it. So that's realism. Realism, though, also doesn't always necessarily mean super realistic. Okay, so there's realism and there's like being realistic. Those are kind of two different things. And Manet is an example of this. So this is Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which means the luncheon on the grass. This was a painting that was rejected by the Salon. Remember, we talked about the Salon was the way for your artwork to be seen. It was sanctioned by the French government. You applied, there was a juror, there was a jury of judges that would say, this is a great painting, it's in the Salon. And they would hang them from the floor to the ceiling. That's where we get the phrase Salon style. And that's why there was huge gold frames, because if you didn't have a huge gold frame and there was no frame and your painting was side by side with all these other paintings around it, you usually get lost in the shuffle. So they made bigger and bigger gold frames to kind of stand out and frame their piece so you would focus on theirs. So this was rejected. So Napoleon III had reasoned that there was a number of people that were rejected from the Salon, that some of them were bad paintings, but some of them were like this and they were rejected because they're controversial. And so since there were so many complaints that there was as many sort of pieces that were not in the show that were in the show, he created a new exhibition called the Salon des Refusés, which is like the salon of the refused, the salon of the pieces that did not get in to the salon. What's interesting about that is more people went to see the Salon des Refusés because they wanted to see the shit that didn't get in, that wasn't good enough, or that was shocking. It's like, hey, don't look at this. It's controversial. It's like, hey, I want to go see that. It's like, you're going to see like a family-friendly movie, a Disney movie, you're going to see that thing with like cars crashing and nudity and like explosions. Like, which one are you going to actually go see? And that's what, back in the day, like, that was more interesting. It was more exciting. And so this painting was rejected. It was in the Salon des Refusés instead. And the reason it was controversial because you got these guys eating lunch. This is actually Manet's brother here. And you've got this model that Parisians would have been able to recognize. They knew who she was. It was shocking because it wasn't like realistic. It was kind of like shoddily painted. They thought it was like garish, like the brush strokes were too loose. Like, that's just a sketch back there of nature like this. And this looks like it could fall out of the composition. The scale's weird because she's way back in the distance, but she's almost as close as them, and she looks like she could pop out of the composition. So it was really interesting, a depiction. But, the people that were complaining about this being nudity is really ironic because there were tons of nudes in the Salon, but they were usually allegorical Greek references or, nude for not just nudity's sake, but they had a purpose, which is interesting because this, if you look at this composition, this is an etching by Raimondi that's based on a Raphael painting that no longer exists. And look at this pose. This is a Greek river god, and here you see they're just having a meal and it looks identical. So he's referencing classical art. Even though people would have expected to see that in the Salon or the museum, this was shocking because it was a common everyday person that was a contemporary of audiences, and they're like, what's going on in this scene? Now, a year later, Olympia was painted by Manet at the same time, the same year that he painted this. And later, in the next Salon, the judges got it right. They didn't want to exclude this one because they remembered this one was so popular, even though it was shocking and controversial. So here, they included Manet's Olympia, which we talked about a bit before, and it's based on Titian's Venus of Urbino, which was at the tail end of the Baroque era. or sorry, the Mannerist era of the Renaissance. And you can see this is about wedding. This one, though, is about Paris brothels. This is a prostitute. How do we know she's a prostitute? She's wearing, sorry about that, she's wearing a choker. She has on her bed, she's still wearing shoes. So she's a streetwalker. We have the cat that represents sexuality and affairs. Here is her attendant, her maid, bringing her flowers from her last suitor, right? Hey, job well done, thanks. But what was shocking about this was like contemporary example of nudity that wasn't classical or allegorical in reference. It was an indictment. It's like we're walking in, boom, and we see this. It's like we're another John entering into this brothel. People knew what was happening in Paris. It was kind of like this gentleman thing to do, but it wasn't something you painted about, right? And this is almost like saying this is bad, that we shouldn't be doing this, right? And so it's based on earlier paintings like Ingres and Titian's. So that's ideas of realism that, again, these ideas kind of bleed back and forth because Manet and then Degas were friends with artists like Monet. And Monet was inspired by the ideas of realism, of showing kind of brushstrokes and stuff that happens every day, but not showing it in a realistic manner. So the Impressionists, a couple of things that had just happened. So 3 things that really influence Impressionism and allow it to be really flourish is locomotive. So the steam locomotive was invented. That means that artists that were interested in the landscape could now like take their canvases, get on a train, and then go out into landscape, get an hour outside the city, and then boom, they see idyllic landscapes. And they could take those sketches back to their studio, work on them, and make a whole series. So you got travel is much easier to get out there. Another thing is an invention of tubes. So they were able to mix paints and put them in tubes. Before, every time you made paint, you had to mix enough to work with, whether it was oil paint or tempera, and then you would apply it to the canvas, but you had no way necessarily of storing it. They would store it in like ox bladders, which is just like really weird and can't be, really smell all that good in your studio. But they invented tin tubes, so you could go to the store and you could buy pre-mixed colors. So you have the ideas of the train to get into the landscape, tubes of paint to be able to easily carry around your paint. And the third is ideas of science, like colors and optics and how light affects color and how it works. So these ideas were starting to be better understood, and these were the first artists that really explored how we perceive color, how we see color in a scientific way. So those 3 things really influence Impressionism. They were really interested in the landscape, and they wanted to show painting as an alternative to photography. So if you have photography and photography can really neatly document realism, then why do you need to paint realism, right? Your painting should do something else. And Munch was very famous for saying the photographer can go outside and take a picture of the earth, but a painter can go to heaven and can go to hell and travel there and paint what it looks like. You can't take a camera to heaven or hell, right? So interesting way of thinking about what you can do with paint. So the Impressionist artists started to exhibit together. They started in the late 1870s. Monet was one of the organizers of this kind of loosely affiliated group. At first, they were not known as the Impressionists, but once they started to exhibit together, they called themselves Artists Incorporated at first, and exhibited that way, and then later the nickname the Impressionists stuck. And it comes from this painting right here, an early example of Impressionism, because it's a sketch. It's an impression of the sunset, or in this case, actually the sunrise. And it's color, right? So looking at simultaneous contrast, complementary contrasting pairs. You've got reds, you've got greens, you've got orange, you've got blue. He's really looking at color harmony and sort of the science of the scene. So it's still reality, but it's an impression. So it's a rough, kind of loose sketch. What they realized that, with artists like that we looked at before, like John Constable would make sketches first, and then he would make the finished paintings that were larger. Monet and others saw those sketches and say, there's something very primal and expressionistic and interesting about those sketches, that's art also. It's kind of like looking at your palette when you're painting and you say, huh, that's kind of neat too, right? What I'm doing here, mixing the colors and not really thinking about it, is just as exciting as this really thoughtful and planned out composition. So here we see an impression, and this really inspires Impressionism. So that other factor that I mentioned about science and color, this is how we perceive light and color throughout the day. It changes. So Monet painted the Rouen Cathedral throughout the day from sort of like dusk till dawn. And you would notice that the church doesn't really change, but the colors do change throughout the day. And it's a way of observation. It's a way of studying color and thinking about science and how light affects how we perceive color. Impressionism also wasn't just in drawing and painting. Auguste Rodin, which the book doesn't talk about him, but I think it's really interesting to see what's happening with Impressionism, with sculpture, as opposed to just painting. So this is the French writer Balzac, and he was a novelist and a playwright. And Rodin, who's very famous for that sculpture, The Thinker, right? You've probably seen that before, where he's like sitting down, he's doing like one of these jobs. He also did this. He did The Gates of Hell, and a really beautiful sculpture called The Kiss. But here, look at this on the right. Look at the detail. It's like you can see him pushing and forcing his hand and sketchily kind of representing the figure, versus who made this depiction of David? That's right, Donatello. Look at how realistic and smooth and kind of polished that is. This is rougher, more tactile. It's kind of like Impressionism, but instead of seeing the brushstrokes, you're seeing your hand as the movement. This leads us into post-Impressionism. A lot of times people have a tough time distinguishing between Impressionism and post-Impressionism. And post-Impressionism is sort of a second wave of Impressionist artists. They weren't the original group that was in the Artist Incorporated, but it's also a unique younger group of artists that wanted to push more of the aspects of almost abstraction. So taking imagery and really thinking about composition. Pushing the 2D picture plane so that you're thinking about the composition as a flat image, as opposed to trying to represent depth, which is based on Manet's ideas as well, that we could see in Luncheon on the Grass. The brushstrokes are exaggerated. The brushstrokes start to become part of the subject matter, which is really interesting. And the compositions are sort of modernized while still looking back to classical ideals. And it's interesting because I feel like a really good way to summarize post-Impressionism is you take realism, you add it to Impressionism, and you get post-Impressionism. So you have scenes like this. Well, how do we see realism in this? Well, it's more, this is George Seurat, and this is a very famous painting. If you want to go see this, it's in the Art Institute of Chicago. But this was about everyday people, believe it or not. This was kind of the working class, the middle class, not necessarily the bourgeoisie, but everybody here is kind of mixing. We wouldn't. Have you seen this? Like people today are taking the paintings and making examples of what it looks like during social distancing. So basically there would just be like one person in his painting right now because we can't all do, doesn't this look amazing? We want to all go do this. Eventually we'll be able to go do this again, right? Just like leisure, like spend time on the beach again. But this is the River Seine in Paris, and they're just camping out on this beach in this island of Grand Jatte. This is a boater who brought a lot of these people here. This is kind of funny. You got this woman with this badunkadunk here. She got this big booty. She's got, but it says like that was the kind of style of the day. You would wear something that would make it look like you had a big booty. She's got a pet monkey. Okay, all right. Little dog here. Really interesting. And this is post Impressionism, but it's also called divisionism or pointillism. So Seurat did tiny little dots. So pointillism is paint applied in tiny dots like and his idea was it relied on optical mixing. So his thought was like, if you put blue and yellow, teeny tiny dots side by side, it'll make green from a distance. So he wanted to show a lot of contrast. And if you look close at this, and this is a huge painting, like I mentioned, you can see it at the Art Institute of Chicago. What a lot of people miss about this was he was so interested in contrast. What I think is beautiful about it, so he's always thinking about like how this figure can contrast with the background. how this figure here is contrasted by the grass here, or these figures are illuminated in light. Everything, even the trees, have a lot of contrast in them, to the point where he didn't even want the image just to end. He had this kind of like area where he would paint along the frame. And you can see if there's orange here in the image, there's blue there, green here, there's red. There's a lot of color theory that's happening. So we're thinking about the 2D picture plane being emphasized and brushstrokes are exaggerated to the point where the brushstrokes themselves sort of become the subject matter. Toulouse-Lautrec was another artist during Post-Impressionism. This is another famous Post-Impressionist painting that you can see at the Art Institute of Chicago. Not a lot of people realize this either, but it's kind of interesting. You can almost see it in this image. Toulouse-Lautrec was really interested in how modern lighting affected the scene. So this was a woman at the bar, and she has this gas light that's electrifying her face, and she looks kind of weird here. These guys were known as flaneurs. They dressed in a particular way that they were observing society. They were like the kind of like outsiders of their day. They were like hipsters today. These are the flaneurs, and Manet was a flaneur. So here we see these flaneurs. This is realism in a sense. Even though it's post-impressionism, it's realism because it's showing us the everyday scene and the reality of the social reality of the day. What's interesting about this painting, his dealer, Toulouse-Lautrec, I'm getting sidetracked here, but he bought this painting and he didn't think he could sell it unless he cut it down. So he actually cut it off right here, and you can kind of see this. So he cut off the bar that he thought was like stretched out too far, and he cut out this woman from it. Luckily, someone saved those pieces, and later when it came into the collection, the Artists of Chicago, they stitched it back together really seamlessly. So you can, if you look in person, you can barely notice how they were able to restore this painting. So it's interesting how artists make things, and then audiences and patrons and people who sell the artwork respond to it in a very different way. Probably one of the best known post-impressionist forerunners was Paul Cézanne. And here's an example of Cézanne, who painted this same image throughout his career, Mont Saint-Victor, and this was looking out his studio, and he really flattened the composition. He was interested in showing kind of everyday things as objects, almost like looking at a landscape as a still life painting. So the mountain becomes flattened, but also it's like 3D in a weird kind of way, that things that are 2D become three-dimensional and things that are three-dimensional become flat, kind of shifting with this space. And then look at how he treats movement and air up here. It really gets the sense of movement, like the branch is blowing in the wind. This is very influential for a couple of artists that are really famous, like Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin here is painting Van Gogh. Van Gogh and Gauguin were roommates. They lived together, not very long though. Van Gogh said, hey, let's get all these artists together. Let's live together in a commune, and let's paint the landscape. Let's create a whole new kind of reality. Well, Gauguin, no one could get along with Van Gogh. Gauguin was the only one who took him up on his offer, and him, after about 6 months, was like, dude, I've had enough. You're an intense dude. So here is Gauguin's depiction of Van Gogh painting his famous sunflowers that we see here. Van Gogh, we know, is really inspired by Impressionism, but he was trained actually as a minister and self-taught as a painter. He was really interested in depicting at first the common everyday sort of peasant experience, and then later when Impressionism was popular, he started to get really interested in showing things as very expressionistic and full of life. So here we see Van Gogh, that famous story of him cutting off part of his ear to send to a woman suitor that he was in love with, and he said, how better to show my love for you than to cut off a piece of my ear and send it to you? What? Like, WTF? Like, obviously it didn't work. Not a good plan. Don't try this, right? But it kind of shows how intense he was as a figure. Actually, in the course of like 3 years, his prime as a painter, he painted about 1,000 works in 3 years. He averaged a painting or a drawing almost every single day, and not just kind of sketches, like masterpieces. And you can see in the background here, he also found time to write 6-page letters to his brother, who was an art dealer, Theo. And Theo tried to sell his paintings. He was able to sell Gauguin's paintings and other Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. Impressionism was huge. Why wasn't Van Gogh able to sell? His stuff was just a little bit outside the norm. And it's believed that Van Gogh maybe only sold one painting during his lifetime. But you can see in the background here is a Japanese print. He was very inspired by Japanese prints and the kind of flattened space that was shown in there. Also, this is an example of a Japanese print here, The Great Wave of Kanagawa by Hokusai that we looked at before. That's about Mount Fuji in the background here in this huge wave. Does this remind you of any of Van Gogh's paintings? You can think about a blue wave in any of his paintings. Probably his best known painting, Starry Night, right? So this is his painting where he's showing the sky in the background sort of looks like Hokusai's wave. And he's showing this dark, quiet, serene scene that's maybe every day, but he adds this sort of otherworldly quality to it. It is larger than life. It's emotional. It's expressionistic. And I can't help but look at Van Gogh's work and see Van Gogh in it. I believe in a way they're all self-portraits. They're very introspective. It's as if we're inside of that figure. Remember the monk above the sea of fog? Or the monk by the sea, the wanderer by the sea of fog, or monk by the sea. It's like we're inside. We're no longer looking at the guy looking at the landscape. We are the guy looking at the landscape and looking within ourselves. That's what I really see. That's my take as an art scholar. When I look at Van Gogh, I think about his life, his tragic life. We all know. Later in his life, he was committed to an insane asylum. He committed himself. He was very tortured as an individual. He shot himself in the stomach and died 9 days later. So a really gruesome way, to think about taking one's life, shooting yourself in the stomach and surviving it and being able to, start to recover, but then later pass away. So I think when you look at his work, they're very psychologically charged and emotionally charged, and we can see that in his work. One other note about Paul Gauguin, I wanted to mention this. So they were roommates, they were friends, but Gauguin had left his family. He was actually a very wealthy banker, an investment banker, had a family, had kids. He ups and leaves and goes to the French countryside. He wanted to return to a simpler life. His family's like, what the hell? What about us? He's like, you'll be good. And he paints in a very primitive way, and he wants to go back. He said, society's been corrupted by modernism. Let's go back to a simpler day and return to a more innocent morality. He didn't find it in the French countryside. He didn't find it there. So then he moved to Tahiti, and he starts painting there. And you can see an example of this on page 491. You can see one of his paintings where he's in Tahiti. Problem is, the primitive wasn't there either. He paints all these nudes there, but people had already been, it's a French colony, people had already been going there for about a century, so most of the people were modernized there as well. So he was basing it on earlier idyllic ideas of the innocence of primitive culture that was untouched by modernism, but he was shocked to find that it was there too. He later got syphilis so he married a woman from Tahiti, is basically like just running buck wild around his island, gets syphilis, still married to his wife back home, wasn't legally divorced, and really bizarro kind of story if you think about the trajectory of him kind of seeking out this subject matter to paint. So those are some of the ideas and ideals with realism, Impressionism, and Post-Impressionism. So remember, I give you the challenge of interpreting a painting. Perhaps you interpret this one. That could be really interesting. You can interpret this one. Recreate it in your house. Signing off. Be well, be safe. Peace out.